History remembers Florence Nightingale as the Lady with the Lamp, a gentle, saintly figure drifting through the wards of Scutari, offering a soft word and a flickering light to the dying. But this is so underselling her and her achievements. Achievements that aren't just historical footnotes. They are the literal infrastructure of the world you live in today. They say that victors write history, but history is edited by the storytellers, and it's smoothed over, sanitised and stripped of its grit until the most dangerous people in our past are turned into porcelain dolls. We've turned a cold-blooded logistical genius and a mathematical pioneer into a Hallmark card. Today, we're pulling the file on Florence Nightingale. Because she wasn't just the lady with the lamp. She was a Trojan horse for reform, a weapon of statistical war, and a woman who smashed the Gilded Cage to rewrite the blueprint of modern life. Pull the file, let's look at the facts. If you're interested in hearing actual history, not the sanitised, politically correct version normally presented, subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoy it, hit the like button and consider sharing it with other fans of real history. Everything you think you know about the lady with the lamp is wrong. Florence Nightingale was born in 1820 in Florence, Italy, the city that gave her her name. She was born to a life of silver spoons, country estates and the suffocating expectations of the British upper class. In the Victorian world, a woman of her status had one job: to be a decorative wife. But Florence had a trauma that the history books often gloss over. It wasn't poverty, it was the Gilded Cage. She described her early life as a slow death of the mind. While her sister studied music and art, Florence was secretly obsessed with something unladylike: mathematics. Florence saw the world in patterns and probabilities. Her rebellion wasn't a teenage whim. It was a decade-long Cold War against her family for the right to study nursing, a profession then associated with drunks and the destitute. Her mother famously asked, "What use is mathematics to a married woman?" But Florence kept secret notebooks. She didn't just do basic arithmetic, she studied spherical trigonometry and the works of Adolphe Quetelet, the father of social statistics. And here's the twist. She used her society skills as a Trojan horse. While writing polite letters to high-ranking family friends in the government, she was quietly gathering data, building networks, and preparing for the war she knew was coming. She just didn't know it would be an actual war. If the Tiger I was a masterpiece of misplaced priorities in steel, the British Army of 1854 was a masterpiece of misplaced priorities in social class. To understand why Florence Nightingale was necessary, you first have to understand the donkeys who ran the show. In the mid-19th century, the British Army didn't promote based on merit. They used the purchase system. If you were wealthy enough, you simply bought your rank. This meant the men leading the charge at Balaclava weren't necessarily the best tacticians. They were just the ones with the largest bank accounts. They were obsessed with the glory of 18th century warfare: polished brass, stiff collars and the perfect cavalry charge. But they had zero interest in the boring side of war, things like food, medicine and clean socks. The results were catastrophic. When the army landed in the Crimea in 1854, the logistics chain snapped almost instantly. The British had plenty of supplies, on paper, but the system was over-engineered with bureaucracy. Take the infamous cabbage incident. Thousands of pounds of vegetables were shipped to the front to prevent the scurvy that was rotting the men's teeth out of their gums. The ships arrived. The cabbage was right there, sitting on the docks. But because the commissariat didn't have a specific form signed by a specific quartermaster, who happened to be 5 miles away at the front, the cabbage sat on the pier until the sun turned it into black, fermented sludge. While the men were dying of malnutrition, ships full of meat and blankets sat in the harbour because the donkeys in charge refused to unload them without a signed manifest from a dead officer. This wasn't an accident. It was the logic of the system. The donkeys believed that sticking to the rules of paperwork was more important than the lives of the lions in the trenches. And then there was the transport collapse. The British bought horses for the cavalry, but forgot to bring enough fodder to feed them. As the horses died of starvation, the army lost its ability to move supplies from the harbour to the hospitals. Men were forced to carry their dying comrades on their backs through miles of knee-deep mud. By the time of the Great Storm of November 1854 hit, sinking ships full of winter coats and ammunition, the British Army was effectively a dead man walking. They were trapped in a logistical death spiral. It was into this specific systemic nightmare that Florence Nightingale was invited. She wasn't being sent to hold hands and offer comfort. She was being sent to fix a supply chain that had been broken by 50 years of aristocratic arrogance. She was about to apply the one thing the War Office lacked: the audit. When Nightingale arrived at the Selimide Barracks in Scutari in November 1854, she didn't find a hospital that was just a bit dirty. She found an architectural death trap. The building had been designed as a military barracks for the Ottoman Empire, never intended to house thousands of wounded men. But the true horror wasn't what was in the wards. It was what was underneath them. The barracks was built directly over a massive, ancient and crumbling cesspool. Because of the misplaced priorities of the military engineers, the building's ventilation system acted like a chimney, pulling toxic gases from the sewers directly up into the wards where the men lay with open wounds. Florence didn't just see patients, she saw a biological feedback loop. This is where the contrarian reality kicks in. In 1854, the medical world was divided. Most doctors believed in miasma, the idea that bad smells themselves caused disease. Others were beginning to look at germ theory. Nightingale, ever the pragmatist, didn't care about the academic debate. She looked at the numbers. She calculated the cubic feet of air per patient. She realised that the donkeys in London had packed the men so tightly that they were literally breathing each other to death. The density of the wards was a multiplier for infection. She noted that the air in the wards was so foul that it was a biological impossibility for a wound to heal. But then she found the smoking gun of the Scutari disaster: the water supply. The hospital's water pipes passed directly through the rotting carcasses of dead horses and human waste that had been dumped near the intake. The logistical anchor here wasn't just a lack of medicine, it was that the hospital itself was a delivery system for cholera. And here is where Nightingale's trauma of the Gilded Cage became her greatest weapon. Because she was used to dealing with high society, she knew how to bypass the hospital's purveyor, the man responsible for supplies who refused to issue soap or towels without a 21-day waiting period for paperwork. Nightingale used her own private funds, raised through her connections at the Times, to buy 2,000 cotton shirts, tons of tin plates and, most importantly, huge quantities of scrubbing brushes. When the official donkeys told her she couldn't open the crates because the Board of Survey hadn't met, Florence, the polite Victorian lady, reportedly took an axe and smashed the crates open herself. She understood a truth that the military didn't. In a crisis, an act of vandalism is often the highest form of logistics. With the crates smashed open and the donkey bureaucracy bypassed, Nightingale and her 38 nurses went to war against the filth. They scrubbed the floors on their hands and knees. They established a massive laundry to boil the lice out of the soldiers' uniforms. They built a kitchen that actually produced edible food instead of sludge. Florence herself worked 20-hour shifts, becoming the lady with the lamp because she was the only one willing to walk the 4 miles of corridors at 2 a.m. to check on the dying. But here is the dark, contrarian truth that the legend leaves out. It did not work. Despite the scrubbing, despite the clean shirts and the better food, the mortality rate at Scutari didn't just stay high, it peaked. By February 1855, nearly 42% of the men admitted to the hospital were leaving in a coffin. Nightingale was cleaning the wards, but the men were still being poisoned. It wasn't until the spring of 1855, when the British government, under immense public pressure, sent an independent sanitary commission to Scutari, that the real killer was found. The commission discovered that the hospital wasn't just built on a cesspool, the sewer pipes were blocked and the water supply was contaminated by a dead horse. So the very men the air breathed was a toxic loop of infection. The commission flushed the sewers and improved the ventilation. Only then did the death rate finally collapse, dropping from 42% to just 2%. This was Nightingale's second great trauma. She realised that her ministering angel act was a band-aid on a gunshot wound. She had been working inside a death trap, and all her effort couldn't fix what the architecture itself was designed to do. She didn't just want to save lives anymore. She wanted to understand the mechanics of death. When she sailed back to England in 1856, she wasn't bringing back stories of heroism. She was bringing back a mountain of raw, terrifying data. She was coming home to prove that the British Army had been killed by its own architecture. When Florence Nightingale returned from the Crimea in 1856, she was a national hero. But she was also a woman with a mission. She knew that as soon as the public's attention shifted, the donkeys at the War Office would go back to their old ways. She knew that stories about dying soldiers would be dismissed as feminist emotionalism. To win the peace, she needed a weapon that was bulletproof. She needed data. But Florence faced a unique contrarian problem. The people she needed to convince, Queen Victoria, the Prime Minister and the stiff-necked generals, didn't have the patience to read 500-page tables of raw numbers. She realised that if you give a politician a spreadsheet, they'll use it as a pillow. But if you give them a picture, you can change their mind. This was the birth of the polar area diagram, or as she called it, the coxcomb. It was the world's first truly effective infographic. Look closely at what she did here. She didn't just show who died, she categorised death into 3 colours. Blue for preventable diseases like cholera and typhus, red for battle wounds, and black for all other causes. The visual impact was undeniable. The blue wedges, the deaths caused by the hospital itself, were massive, sprawling wings that dwarfed the red slivers of actual combat deaths. The radial format made the disparity impossible to ignore. Where a bar chart could be skimmed, the coxcomb demanded attention. It was a mathematical indictment of the British Empire, showing them in a way that couldn't be dismissed that the army was effectively committing suicide through poor sanitation. But here is the contrarian twist. Florence didn't just create the chart, she weaponized the distribution. She used her Gilded Cage social status to ensure these charts were printed in high quality colour, which was expensive and rare at the time, and she mailed them directly to every influential person in the country. Nightingale was going viral before the internet ever existed. She pioneered a concept we now take for granted in data science: healthcare outcomes research. She argued that every hospital in the world should collect data in the same way so that we could compare which treatments actually worked. Before Florence, a successful hospital was just one where the doctors were famous. After Florence, a successful hospital was the one where the data proved that the patients survived. Florence Nightingale became the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society in 1858. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a pioneer of applied statistics. She proved that a well-designed graph could be more powerful than a cavalry charge. She used her mathematics to force a royal commission into the health of the army, leading to a total overhaul of military medicine that saved millions of lives in the century to follow. Here is where the story takes its strangest turn. After returning from the Crimea, Florence Nightingale spent the next 40 years working from her bed. She claimed to be an invalid, possibly suffering for what we would now call chronic fatigue or the lingering effects of Crimean fever. But whether her illness was physical, psychological or strategic, it did not slow her down. From her bedroom, she rewrote the blueprints of global health. She founded the first secular nursing school at St Thomas's Hospital in 1860. She designed the Nightingale Ward, the template for cross-ventilated hospital architecture that we still see today. She consulted on the sanitation of India, advised on US Civil War hospitals, and analysed the medical failures of the Franco-Prussian War. She was essentially the world's first global healthcare consultant. And here's the final contrarian insight. She realised that as a war hero confined to her bed, she could influence more change through letters and data than by standing in a ward. She'd learned from the donkeys of the Crimea that presence doesn't equal power, results do. She was, for all intents and purposes, the world's first practitioner of working from home. And she was more productive than the entire War Office combined. Today, when you see a data dashboard tracking a pandemic or walk through a hospital wing designed for airflow and infection control, you are looking at Florence Nightingale's legacy. She proved that a calculator can save more lives than a scalpel, and that the right graph at the right moment can change the world. I'm Gavin Wilson, and this is the Contrarian Chronicles. Pull the file, check the facts. And if you want to support more deep dives into people who actually changed history, not the sanitised versions but the messy, brilliant, contrarian truth, check out the link below for Chronicle gear and early access to future episodes. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next Chronicle.